The wind howled through the desolate streets of Oldhaven, a forgotten district on the edge of the sprawling city of Nexus Prime. Icy rain lashed against the cracked pavement, pooling in the potholes that scarred the roads. Neon signs flickered, weakly, their glow barely piercing the darkness, casting eerie reflections on the wet ground. It was the kind of night where even the most desperate souls sought shelter, the kind of night where the world seemed to hold its breath, suffocated by the weight of the storm. Marcus Reed stood in his small, cluttered apartment, staring out the grimy window at the chaos beyond. He had never liked storms. Too many memories of cold nights spent alone, too many reminders of a life that had once been full, but now felt hollow. At 38, Marcus was a man who had learned to live with solitude. He had a wiry build, his dark hair streaked with early gray, and his hazel eyes carried the weight of too many sleepless nights. He worked as a mechanic at a run-down garage on the edge of Oldhaven, fixing up the battered vehicles of those who couldn't afford better. It wasn't a glamorous life, but it was his, a quiet, predictable existence that kept him out of trouble. His apartment reflected that simplicity. A single room with a sagging couch, a small kitchenette, and a bed shoved against the wall. The only decoration was a faded photograph on the counter, showing a younger Marcus with his sister, Elena, both of them smiling in a park that no longer existed. Elena had been gone for years, a casualty of the war that had torn the galaxy apart, and Marcus had never quite figured out how to fill the void she'd left behind. He turned away from the window, rubbing his hands together to ward off the chill that seeped through the walls. The radiator in the corner hissed weakly, doing little to combat the cold. Marcus shuffled to the kitchenette, pulling a packet of instant noodles from the cupboard. It wasn't much, but it was dinner, and on nights like this, he didn't have the energy for anything more. As the microwave hummed, he leaned against the counter, listening to the wind battering the building. The sound was relentless, a reminder of how alone he truly was. Then came the knock. It was sharp, deliberate, cutting through the storm's roar like a gunshot. Marcus froze, his hand halfway to the microwave. No one knocked on his door. Not at this hour, not in this weather, not in this part of the city. Oldhaven wasn't known for its friendliness. The neighbors kept to themselves, and Marcus had no friends left to come calling. The knock came again, louder, more urgent, and a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. Whoever was out there would go away eventually, wouldn't they? But the sound echoed a third time, and something about it, the desperation, the hollow urgency, made him move. He crossed the room in a few quick strides, his boots scuffing against the worn wooden floor. The door creaked as he pulled it open, the icy wind rushing in like a living thing, biting at his skin. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he saw. A small bundle lay on his doorstep, half buried in the sleet that had begun to accumulate. Then, it moved. A faint, pearlescent glow emanated from within the fabric, and a pair of luminous silver eyes blinked up at him, wide and pleading. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. It was a baby, not human. The infant's skin shimmered with a soft, otherworldly sheen, its tiny hands ending in delicate webbed fingers. A weak, whimpering sound escaped its lips, cutting through the storm's roar. Marcus's gaze darted up, searching the darkness beyond his doorstep, and that's when he saw her. A tall, gaunt figure standing just outside the faint light of his doorway, her silhouette trembling in the freezing rain. She was a Clithar, one of the alien refugees stranded on Earth after the galactic conflict that had shattered their civilization. Marcus had seen their kind on the news. Tall, ethereal beings with elongated limbs, pearlescent skin, and glowing silver eyes, once revered for their wisdom and technology. But the war had left them broken. Their homeworld, Clithara, had been reduced to ash, their fleets destroyed and their people scattered across hostile planets. On Earth, they were outcasts, scraping by in the shadows, unwanted and forgotten. This woman's silver eyes locked onto his, her face gaunt with exhaustion, her tattered cloak clinging to her soaked frame. She was starving, desperate, and her gaze held a raw, unspoken plea. The baby cried again, a soft, heartbreaking sound, and Marcus's heart clenched. She had left her child here, on his doorstep, in the middle of a storm. How many doors had she knocked on before this? How many times had she been turned away, met with hostility or indifference? Marcus's mind raced. He could close the door, pretend he hadn't seen anything. It wasn't his problem. But the baby's tiny hand twitched against the cold, and something inside him broke. Without a second thought, he knelt down and scooped the infant into his arms. It was so light, too light, but the moment he held it, the child quieted, sensing the warmth of his body. When he looked up, the mother hadn't moved. She stood there, shivering violently, her eyes fixed on her child in his arms. She thought he was going to take the baby inside and leave her out in the cold. Marcus cursed, under his breath running a hand through his damp hair. "Damn it," he muttered, then louder, "Get inside, both of you." The woman flinched, her eyes widening with suspicion. For a moment she didn't move, as if expecting a trap. But when she saw the way Marcus cradled her child, something in her expression shifted. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped across the threshold, and Marcus shut the door behind her, sealing out the storm. She tensed at the sound, her fingers twitching as if ready to fight or flee. Marcus could only imagine what she'd been through to be so on edge. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice calm. She didn't respond, just stood there, dripping water onto the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Up close, Marcus could see how dire her condition was. Her pearlescent skin, which should have glowed with vitality, was dull and faded. Her cheeks were hollow, her frame skeletal. She looked like she hadn't eaten or slept in days. The baby made a soft noise against his chest, and Marcus instinctively adjusted his grip, the tiny weight settling against him. "You hungry?" he asked. The woman's throat bobbed, her jaw tightening. Pride battled with survival in her eyes, but finally she whispered, "Yes." Marcus nodded, gesturing toward the worn couch in the corner of the room. "Sit. You need to warm up." She hesitated, then moved toward the couch, her legs trembling as she sank onto it, as if every ounce of strength had drained from her body. Marcus set the baby down gently beside her, the infant cooing softly as it sensed its mother's presence. He turned to the kitchenette, rummaging through his sparse supplies. He wasn't much of a cook, but he found a can of broth and some stale crackers. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and it was food. When he returned, the woman's eyes flickered, to the broth, then to the crackers, her hunger unmistakable. "It's not much," Marcus admitted, setting the food on the small table in front of her. "But it'll help." She hesitated for only a moment before reaching for the crackers, her hands shaking as she tore into them. She ate with a desperation that broke Marcus's heart. Each bite hurried, as if she feared the food would disappear. He sat across from her on a rickety chair, saying nothing, letting her eat in peace. When the broth was gone and the crackers reduced to crumbs, the woman's breathing steadied, though her hands still trembled. She turned to the baby, who had begun to stir, a soft cry escaping its lips. She scooped the child into her arms, cradling it close, and murmured something in Claythar, a melodic, ancient language that Marcus didn't understand but felt in his bones. Then she hesitated, her body tensing as she glanced at him. Marcus realized what she was about to do: feed her child. He'd read that the Claythar treated such acts with reverence, a sacred bond, and here she was, in a stranger's home, stripped of privacy. He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll, give you a minute," he said, standing and heading toward the hallway that led to his bedroom. He glanced back just before rounding the corner, seeing her curl in on herself, the baby nestled against her chest. The shame in her posture made his chest ache, but he gave her the space she needed. Marcus leaned against the wall in his bedroom, staring at the faded photograph on the counter. Elena's smile seemed to mock him, a reminder of a time when he hadn't been so alone. She'd been his anchor, the one who'd kept him grounded after their parents died in a factory explosion when he was 16. Elena had been older by 3 years, and she'd taken on the role of both sister and guardian, working odd jobs to keep them afloat while Marcus finished school. But the war had changed everything. The Galactic War had erupted when Marcus was in his early 20s, a conflict between humanity and a coalition of alien races, including the Clethar. It wasn't a war anyone had wanted, but greed and fear had driven it forward. Humanity's desire for resources, the aliens' need to protect their territories. The Clethar had been one of the most powerful races in the coalition, their technology far surpassing humanity's, but their strength had also made them a target. When their homeworld was destroyed in a brutal orbital bombardment, the Clethar were left scattered, their survivors fleeing to planets like Earth, where they were met with suspicion and hostility. Elena had been a nurse during the war, volunteering to help the wounded on both sides. She'd always believed in doing the right thing, even when it put her at risk. Marcus had begged her to stay out of it, to keep her head down, but Elena had been stubborn. "If I don't help, who will?" she'd said, her voice firm but gentle. She'd died in a bombing raid on a refugee camp trying to save a group of Clethar children. Marcus had been at the garage when he got the news, and the memory of that day still haunted him. The way his hands had shaken as he dropped his wrench, the way his boss had looked at him with pity. He'd never forgiven himself for not being there, for not protecting her. Now, as he stood in his bedroom, listening to the soft sounds of the Clethar mother and her child in the next room, Marcus felt a pang of guilt. Elena would have helped them without hesitation. She would have known what to say, how to make them feel safe. Marcus, on the other hand, was fumbling through this, unsure of what to do next. He'd let them in, given them food and shelter, but what now? He couldn't keep them here forever, not in Oldhaven, where Clethar were seen as threats, as invaders, even years after the war had ended. He pushed off the wall and returned to the living room. The woman was still curled on the couch, the baby now settled against her chest, its breathing even. She looked up as Marcus entered, her silver eyes wary but less guarded than before. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice carrying the lilting accent of her people. Marcus nodded, sitting back in his chair. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him with even that much. Finally, she said, "Lyra, and this is Nira." She glanced down at the baby, her expression softening. "I'm Marcus," he replied. "You're safe here, Lyra, at least for tonight." Lyra nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. Marcus couldn't blame her. Trust was hard to come by in a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. He leaned back in his chair, studying her. "How long have you been out there?" he asked. "Weeks," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe longer." "Time blurs." She looked down at Nira, her fingers brushing gently over the baby's pearlescent skin. "I tried to find shelter. No one would help. Some were unkind." Marcus's stomach twisted. He didn't need to ask what she meant by unkind. He'd seen the way Clethar were treated in Nexus Prime, shunned, harassed, sometimes worse. There were stories of Clethar being rounded up and sent to overcrowded detention centers, where disease and starvation ran rampant. Others simply disappeared, their fates whispered about in dark alleys. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate. Lyra didn't respond, her focus on Nira. The baby stirred slightly, her tiny hand curling into a fist, and Lyra's expression softened further. "She's strong," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "She has to be." Marcus nodded, watching the infant. It was a miracle they'd survived this long, out in the storm with nothing but a tattered cloak to shield them. Silence settled between them, but it wasn't as heavy as before. After a while, Lyra spoke again. "Why did you help us?" she asked, her silver eyes searching his face. Marcus sighed, leaning forward. "Because you needed it," he said simply, "and because no one else did." Lyra looked at him, and for the first time there was no suspicion in her gaze. She nodded, finishing the last of her broth, and Marcus handed her a pile of clean clothes, too big but warm. "There's a spare room down the hall," he said. "You can use it." Lyra blinked as if the offer was too much to process, but she nodded, and for the first time, she looked like she believed she was safe. Marcus cleared the table, taking the empty bowl to the sink. "Get some sleep," he said over his shoulder. "You're safe here." When he glanced back, Lyra was still looking at him, and for the first time she looked like she believed him. The next morning, Marcus woke to the sound of soft cooing coming from the living room. He rubbed the sleep from his eyes, his body aching. From a night spent on the couch, he'd given Lyra and Nira the bedroom, figuring they needed the rest more than he did. The storm had died down overnight, leaving behind a gray, overcast sky that cast a muted light through the curtains. Marcus stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and made his way to the living room. Lyra was awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with Nira in her lap. The baby was reaching for a strand of her mother's long, dark hair, her silver eyes bright with curiosity. Lyra looked up as Marcus entered, her posture tensing slightly, but she relaxed when she saw it was just him. "Good. Morning," Marcus said, his voice rough from sleep. Lyra nodded, her gaze returning to Nira. "She slept well," she said softly. "Thank you. For the room." Marcus waved a hand dismissively. "Don't mention it." He moved to the kitchenette, filling a pot with water for coffee. As the water heated, he glanced back at Lyra. "You want some coffee? It's not much, but it'll warm you up." Lyra tilted her head, her brow furrowing. "I do not know what that is." Marcus blinked, then chuckled softly. "Right. I guess you wouldn't." He poured the dark liquid into 2 mugs, the steam curling in lazy ribbons, and slid one across the counter toward her. "Try it. It's bitter, but it grows on you." Lyra hesitated, then reached for the mug, wrapping her fingers around it as if savoring the warmth. She took a cautious sip, her brow furrowing further as the taste hit her tongue. "Bitter," she confirmed, but she didn't put the mug down, cradling it between her hands as if it were a lifeline. Marcus took a sip of his own, leaning against the counter. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, he could see things he hadn't noticed the night before. The faint scars crisscrossing Lyra's arms, the sharp angles of her collarbones that hinted at months of malnourishment, the way she sat with a straight-backed poise that spoke of discipline, but with a subtle edge of restraint, as if even rest was something she didn't allow herself. "You were a soldier, weren't you?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. Lyra went still, her fingers tightening around the mug. She didn't answer right away, but she didn't need to. The way her posture shifted, the way her gaze darkened, he'd hit. A nerve. Finally, she exhaled through her nose. "I was," she said, her voice flat. Marcus nodded slowly. He'd suspected as much. The Clithar had fought fiercely during the war, their soldiers known for their skill and resilience, but most of them hadn't been given a choice. It had been a matter of survival, just as it had been for humanity. "Did you lose someone?" he asked, his voice softer this time. Lyra's gaze flickered, and for the first time Marcus saw something raw beneath her guarded exterior. "Everyone," she said simply. The weight of that single word settled between them like a stone. Marcus clenched his jaw, his own memories of loss surfacing. Elena, their parents, the friends he'd lost to the war. He knew what it was like to lose everything, to be left with nothing but the ghosts of the past. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Lyra inhaled as if about to respond, but before she could, Nira stirred in her lap, letting out a soft whimper. Immediately, Lyra's focus shifted, her expression softening as she stroked the baby's back. In slow, soothing circles, Marcus watched as Nira calmed, pressing herself closer to her mother's warmth. Lyra exhaled, her shoulders relaxing just slightly, then looked back up at him. "You lost people too," she said. It wasn't a question. Marcus hesitated, but then he nodded. Yeah, there were things he didn't talk about, names he didn't say aloud, but even if he had, he wasn't sure Lyra would have understood the depth of his grief. They had been enemies once, their people pitted against each other in a war neither side had truly won. But now, sitting across from each other in his tiny apartment, They were just two people haunted by the same ghosts. Lyra studied him for a moment longer, then did something that caught him off guard. She reached across the table, her fingertips brushing against the back of his hand. A fleeting, hesitant touch, one she could have easily retracted if she'd changed her mind. But she didn't. Marcus didn't move, didn't pull away. He just let her touch linger, barely there but significant in a way he couldn't quite explain. Clither didn't touch humans, not unless they had to, which meant this moment, this choice was something more. Lyra withdrew her hand as quickly as she'd offered it, wrapping her fingers around her mug once more. But the air between them had changed. The walls weren't entirely gone, but they had cracked, and for the first time Marcus wondered if, maybe, just maybe, he wasn't just helping her. Maybe she was helping him too. Over the next few days, Lyra and Neera settled into a fragile routine in Marcus's apartment. Lyra was still cautious, her movements deliberate, her gaze always scanning for threats, but she began to relax, if only slightly. Neera, on the other hand, seemed to thrive in the warmth of the apartment, her soft coos and curious babbling filling the silence that had once dominated Marcus's life. He found himself growing attached to the little one, her silver eyes lighting up whenever he entered the room, her tiny hands reaching for him with a trust that felt both humbling and terrifying. Marcus did what he could to make them comfortable. He scrounged up what food he had, making simple meals of broth, bread, and whatever canned goods he could find. He gave Lyra a pile of his old clothes, shirts and sweaters that were too big for her but warm enough to replace her tattered cloak. He even fashioned a makeshift crib for Neera out of an old crate, lining it with blankets to make it soft. Lyra watched him work, her expression unreadable, but there was a quiet gratitude in her eyes that spoke louder than words. On the third day, Marcus returned from a shift at the garage to find Lyra sitting on the floor, Neera in her lap, humming, a soft, melodic tune in Clithar. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, a reminder of a culture that had been all but erased by the war. Marcus leaned against the doorway, watching them, a small smile tugging at his lips. "She likes that," he said, nodding toward Neera, who was gazing up at her mother with wide, adoring eyes. Lyra looked up, her humming stopping abruptly. "It is a song my mother sang to me," she said, her voice soft. "A lullaby from Clithara. It speaks of the stars, of the light that guides us home." Marcus nodded, stepping into the room. "It's beautiful." He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to stop." Lyra studied him for a moment, then resumed her humming, her voice weaving through the air like a thread of light. Marcus sat on the couch, listening, letting the sound wash over him. For the first time in years, his apartment didn't feel so empty, but the peace was short-lived. That evening, as Marcus took out the trash in the back alley behind his building, he noticed an unnatural stillness in the air. The usual sounds of Oldhaven, the distant hum of traffic, the muffled voices of neighbors arguing through thin walls, the occasional clatter of a stray cat, were absent. It was as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Marcus's instincts, honed by years of living in a rough neighborhood, screamed that something was wrong. He turned back toward the apartment, his senses on. High alert. The shadows between the buildings stretched long and dark in the dim glow of the streetlights, but he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling of unease lingered, a weight in his chest that he couldn't shake. He stepped inside, locking the door behind him, the warmth of the apartment a stark contrast to the frigid air outside. Lyra was in the living room, rocking Neera gently in her arms. She looked up as Marcus entered, her silver eyes narrowing slightly. "It's too quiet outside," she said, her voice low. Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "Yeah, I noticed." He hesitated, then added, "You should get some rest. I'll keep an eye out." Lyra didn't argue, but there was a tension in her posture that hadn't been there before. She rose, cradling Neera, and disappeared into the bedroom, her movements silent and precise, a remnant of her military training. Marcus sat on the couch, his gaze fixed on the door, his mind racing. He didn't know what was coming, but he knew it wasn't good. The knock came just after midnight, sharp and precise, cutting through the silence like a blade. Marcus's body went rigid, his heart pounding in his chest. Across the room, Lyra emerged from the bedroom, Nira in her arms, her posture shifting from exhaustion to alertness in an instant. The baby stirred, sensing her mother's tension, but Lyra held her close, her silver eyes snapping toward the door. Marcus moved first, stepping toward the door as casually as he could, though every muscle in his body was tense. He peered through. The people, his breath catching in his throat. Two men stood outside, their faces hard and unreadable. They weren't wearing uniforms, but their posture, the way they stood with their hands just out of sight, told him everything he needed to know. These weren't neighbors or delivery men. These were hunters. Marcus glanced back at Lyra, his voice a whisper. "Take Nira and go to the bedroom. Lock the door." Lyra's grip on the baby tightened, her eyes wide with fear. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Marcus said, "but I don't want to take chances." She hesitated for only a second before nodding, then disappeared down the hall, the soft click of the bedroom door locking behind her. Marcus turned back to the entrance, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He unlocked the door and opened, just enough to step halfway into the frame, blocking the view inside. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice even, though his pulse pounded in his ears. The man closest to him had short, cropped hair and a weathered face, his eyes cold and calculating. His companion was younger, thinner, but there was a twitchiness to him, as if he was waiting for an excuse to act. "You Marcus Reed?" the older man asked. Marcus didn't answer right away, crossing his arms and leaning against the door frame. "Who's asking?" The younger man glanced toward the window, his eyes narrowing. "We heard you've got a guest staying with you." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, his mind racing. He knew exactly what they were looking for, or rather, who. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, keeping his tone neutral. The older man exhaled through his nose, his expression hardening. "Look, I'll keep this simple. We know a Clythar woman's been seen in this neighborhood. A woman with a baby. Now, we're not saying you have her, but if you did, it'd be in your best interest to tell us." Marcus's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew what happened to Clythar refugees when they were caught. Best case, they were deported to overcrowded stations where disease and starvation ran rampant. Worst case, they were never seen again. He gave a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "A Clythar in this neighborhood? You think one of them would last 5 minutes around here?" The younger man smirked, but there was no humor in it. "You'd be surprised what people are willing to risk." Marcus shrugged, his expression carefully neutral. "Haven't seen anything. Now, unless you've got a warrant, I'd appreciate it if you got off my property." The older man narrowed his eyes, studying Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to push harder. Finally, he nodded once, his voice laced with warning. "If you see anything, you let us know." He handed Marcus a card with a number scrawled on it, then turned and walked back down the street, the younger man following close behind. Marcus watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest. Only when they were out of sight did he let out a slow, steady breath, locking the door behind him. He turned back toward the hallway, and Lyra was already there, standing in the shadows, Nira clutched tightly to her chest. He hadn't even heard her move. "They'll come back," she murmured, her voice trembling. Marcus met her gaze, his jaw tightening. "I know." He paused, then added, "But they won't find you. I won't let them." Lyra's eyes widened slightly, something flickering in her expression, something Marcus couldn't quite name, but whatever it was, she believed him. And for now, that was enough. Marcus didn't sleep that night. After the men left, he checked the locks twice, then positioned himself on the couch, close enough to hear if anyone came near the apartment. He'd done his best to reassure Lyra, but the truth was he wasn't sure what would happen next. They had been lucky this time. The men hadn't pushed harder, hadn't forced their way inside, but Marcus knew that luck wouldn't hold out forever. They would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't be asking questions. Lyra didn't sleep much either. She stayed in the bedroom with Nira, keeping the baby close, her body rigid with tension. Marcus could hear her moving around, pacing softly, as if preparing herself for the inevitable. By morning, a decision had been made. "We need to leave," Lyra said, her voice firm despite the exhaustion in her eyes. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom, Nira asleep in her arms, her small fingers curled around a fold of her mother's shirt. Marcus had expected it, but hearing the words still sent a sharp pang through his chest. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Where?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze dropping to Nira. "I do not know," she admitted, "but we cannot stay." Marcus leaned back against the counter, crossing his arms. "They'll be watching the roads, the transport hubs too. You can't just walk out of here without a plan." Lyra nodded, her jaw tightening. "There are places, safe places for Clithar. If I can get to one, I will find help." Marcus studied her, his mind racing. He knew of the safe havens she spoke of, underground, networks run by Clithar and their allies, hidden from the authorities. But getting to one would be dangerous, especially with hunters on their trail. "And if you don't make it?" he asked. Lyra didn't answer, her silence speaking volumes. That was the part she hadn't figured out yet, the part that terrified her. Marcus rubbed the back of his neck, his thoughts a tangled mess. He could let her go, let her take her chances on her own. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But the thought of her and Nira out there, alone and hunted, made his stomach twist. "If we run, we need a plan," he said finally. "You can't just disappear into the city and hope for the best." Lyra shifted, adjusting Nira in her arms. "I did not expect you to come with us," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. Marcus froze, the words hitting him harder than he'd expected. She had already accepted that he wouldn't follow, that this was where their paths would split. It shouldn't have bothered him. He'd known from the moment he let her in that this wasn't permanent, that one day she and Nira would leave, and his life would go back to the way it had been. But now, the thought of that silence, that emptiness, felt wrong. "I didn't say I wouldn't go," he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "I'm not letting you do this alone. You don't know the city like I do. You don't know who to avoid, which streets are watched. You need someone who does." Lyra's head snapped up, her silver eyes widening. "Marcus," she began, as if to argue, but she stopped herself. Instead, she just looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for something. Sincerity, maybe, or a reason to trust him. After a long moment, she let out a quiet breath. "All right," she said, her voice heavy with something unspoken. They didn't have much time. Marcus grabbed an old backpack from his closet, stuffing it with essentials, food, water, extra clothes. He didn't have much in the way of weapons, just an old hunting knife and a battered revolver he hadn't fired in years. It would have to do. Lyra worked quickly too, packing lightly, only taking what Nira needed. Blankets, a spare set of clothes, a small pouch filled with something Marcus didn't recognize. She moved with precision, her military training evident in the way she double-checked. Everything without wasting a single motion. It wasn't until they were nearly ready to go that Marcus hesitated. Once they walked out that door, there was no coming back. His life, the quiet, predictable routine he'd built, would be gone. He'd spent years keeping his head down, staying out of trouble, making sure the war remained nothing more than a distant memory. And now he was throwing it all away for them, for her. He should have been scared. Instead, he felt alive. Lyra stood near the door, Nira tucked securely against her chest. She looked at him, waiting. Marcus took a slow breath, then nodded. "Let's go." They moved through Nexus Prime like shadows, keeping to the alleys and back streets, avoiding the main roads where patrols were more likely to spot them. Marcus led the way, guiding them through the labyrinth of Oldhaven, his knowledge of the city's underbelly their only advantage. Lyra stayed close, her grip firm around Nira, her silver eyes scanning every corner for threats. They didn't speak much. There was no need to. The tension between them was enough to keep them moving, each step a reminder of the danger that lurked behind them. Oldhaven was a maze of crumbling buildings and narrow alleys, a place where the city's forgotten came to disappear. It was also a place where danger thrived. Gangs, scavengers, and informants who would sell out anyone for the right price. Marcus knew the risks, but he also knew the shortcuts, the hidden paths that could keep them out of sight. He led them through a series of back alleys, past rusted fire escapes and overflowing dumpsters, the air thick with the smell of decay and damp concrete. They stopped briefly in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse, the walls covered in graffiti that told stories of rebellion and despair. Marcus crouched down, peering around the corner to check for any signs of pursuit. The street was empty, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Lyra knelt beside him, Neera cradled against her chest, the baby's soft breaths the only sound in the stillness. "We need to keep moving," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. "There's a safe house a few miles from here. A friend of mine, Jackson. He used to run with a group that helped refugees during the war. If he's still there, he might be able to help." Lyra nodded, her expression unreadable. "And if he's not?" Marcus didn't answer, but the weight of her question hung between them. If Jackson wasn't there, or worse, if he'd turned, they'd be on their own with nowhere to go and hunters closing in. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. "We'll deal with that when we get there," he said, standing, and motioning for her to follow. They continued through the city, the hours stretching on as the gray sky darkened into evening. Nexus Prime was a city of contrasts, gleaming skyscrapers in the central districts, where the wealthy lived in luxury, and the outer slums like Oldhaven, where people scraped by on whatever they could find. The war had only widened the gap, leaving the poor to fend for themselves while the rich turned a blind eye. For Clithar like Lyra, the city was a prison, a place where they were hunted and despised, their very existence a reminder of a conflict that humanity wanted to forget. As they neared the edge of Oldhaven, Marcus spotted a flicker of movement in the distance, a group of men standing under a streetlight, their postures tense, their eyes scanning the area. He grabbed Lyra's arm, pulling her into the shadow of a nearby building. "Patrol," he whispered, his heart pounding. Lyra's grip on Neera tightened, her body tensing. "Can we go around?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Marcus nodded, his mind racing as he mapped out an alternate route. "There's a tunnel up ahead, an old maintenance access point. It'll take us under the street, but it's not safe. Smugglers use it sometimes, and there's no telling who we might run into." Lyra's silver eyes met his, her expression resolute. "We have no choice," she said. Marcus nodded, leading her toward the tunnel entrance, a rusted grate hidden behind a pile of debris. He pried it open, the metal groaning in protest, and gestured for Lyra to go first. She hesitated for only a moment before slipping inside, Neera cradled against her chest. Marcus followed, pulling the grate closed behind them. The tunnel was dark and damp, the air heavy with the smell of mold and stagnant water. Marcus pulled a small flashlight from his backpack, its weak beam casting long shadows on the walls. The sound of dripping water echoed around them, mingling with the faint scurrying of rats in the distance. Lyra moved silently beside him, her military training evident in the way she navigated the uneven ground, her steps sure and deliberate. They hadn't gone far when Marcus heard a sound up ahead, a low murmur of voices, followed by the clink of metal. He stopped, holding up a hand to signal Lyra to do the same. She froze, her body tensing, her silver eyes narrowing as she strained to listen. The voices grew louder, and Marcus caught snippets of conversation. Something about a shipment, a buyer, and a price. Smugglers just as he'd feared. "We need to backtrack," Marcus whispered, turning to Lyra. But before they could move, a beam of light swept through the tunnel, illuminating them in its harsh glare. "Well, well," a voice called out, rough and mocking. "What do we have here?" Marcus's heart sank as three figures emerged from the shadows, their faces hard and unreadable. The leader was a broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, his eyes glinting with a dangerous curiosity. The other two flanked him, one holding a flashlight, the other gripping a makeshift blade. Marcus stepped in front of Lyra, shielding her and Nira, his hand inching toward the hunting knife at his belt. "We don't want trouble," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his chest. "We're just passing through," the leader smirked, his gaze flickering to Lyra and the baby in her arms. "A human and a Clythar, huh? That's a new one." He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You know, there's a bounty on Clythar. These days, especially ones with kids, someone's paying good money to have them dealt with." Marcus's blood ran cold, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're not worth your time," he said, his voice firm. "Let us go and we'll be out of your way." The leader chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I don't think so," he said, nodding to his companions. "Grab them." Before Marcus could react, the man with the blade lunged forward, his weapon aimed at Marcus's chest. Instinct took over, and Marcus dodged to the side, drawing his hunting knife and slashing at the man's arm. The smuggler grunted in pain, dropping the blade, but the second man was already moving, tackling Marcus to the ground. The flashlight fell, its beam spinning wildly as the tunnel descended into chaos. Lyra acted quickly, her military training kicking in. She shifted Nira to one arm, using her free hand to grab a loose pipe from the ground. With a swift, precise strike, she brought it down on the second smuggler's head, sending him sprawling. The leader roared in anger, drawing a pistol from his belt, but Marcus was already back on his feet, tackling him before he could fire. The two men struggled, the gun skidding across the ground, and Marcus drove his knee into the leader's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. "Go!" Marcus shouted to Lyra, his voice hoarse. She didn't hesitate, sprinting down the tunnel with Nira in her arms, her movements swift and silent. Marcus landed a final punch on the leader, then grabbed the flashlight and followed, his heart pounding. In his chest, they didn't stop running until they reached the other end of the tunnel, emerging into a narrow alley on the edge of Oldhaven. Marcus leaned against the wall, gasping for breath, his body aching from the fight. Lyra stood beside him, her chest heaving, Nira whimpering softly against her shoulder. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his voice rough. Lyra nodded, her silver eyes scanning the alley for any signs of pursuit. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "Thank you," Marcus nodded, wiping the sweat from his brow. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Jackson's place isn't far." They continued through the city, the encounter in the tunnel a stark reminder of the dangers they faced. Nexus Prime was a city that devoured the weak, and for Lyra and Nira, there was no safe place to hide, not unless they could find a way out. Jackson's safe house was a rundown tenement building on the edge of Oldhaven, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in peeling paint. Marcus knocked on the door in a specific pattern. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 more. A code Jackson had taught him years ago. For a moment, there was no response, and Marcus's heart sank. If Jackson wasn't here, they were out of options. But then the door creaked open, and a grizzled man with a salt and pepper beard peered out, his dark eyes narrowing as he took in Marcus, Lyra, and the baby in her arms. Jackson was in his late 50s, a former smuggler who'd turned to helping refugees after the war. Driven by a guilt Marcus had never fully understood. He was a gruff man, his face lined with scars and hard living, but there was a kindness in his eyes that belied his rough exterior. "Marcus," Jackson said, his voice low and gravelly. "What the hell are you doing here?" "We need help," Marcus said, cutting straight to the point. "Hunters are after her." He nodded toward Lyra, who stood silently beside him, her posture tense. Jackson's gaze flickered to Lyra, then to Nira, and his expression softened slightly. "Clythar," he murmured, more to himself than to them. He stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. "Get inside before someone sees you." The interior of the safe house was as run down as the exterior, with mismatched furniture and crates stacked against the walls. A single lantern cast a dim glow over the room, revealing a small group of people, humans and Clithar alike, sitting in the shadows, their faces etched with exhaustion and fear. This was a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where the hunted could find a moment's respite. Jackson closed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy bolt. "You've got hunters on your tail?" he asked, turning to Marcus. "Yeah," Marcus said, setting his backpack down. "They came to my place last night. We barely got out in time." Jackson nodded, his expression grim. "They've been cracking down lately. Someone's paying big money to round up Clithar, especially the ones with kids. Word is they're being sent to some black site facility off-world. No one knows what happens to them after that." Lyra's grip on Neera tightened, her silver eyes darkening with fear. "I will not let them take her," she said, her voice low but fierce. Jackson studied her for a moment, then nodded. "You won't have to," he said. "I've got a contact, a pilot named Rhea. She runs a cargo ship out of a hidden launch site on the outskirts of the city. She's been smuggling refugees to the outer colonies for years. There's a ship leaving in 2 days. If you can get to it, you'll be out of Nexus Prime for good." Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but it was tempered by caution. "What's the catch?" he asked. Jackson sighed, running a hand through his beard. "The catch is getting there. The city's crawling with hunters, and the launch site's a good 20 miles from here. You'll need to move fast, and you'll need to stay off the radar. I can get you some supplies, but after that, you're on your own." Marcus nodded, his jaw tightening. "We'll make it." Jackson led them to a small room, in the back of the safe house where a few crates of supplies were stored. He handed Marcus a bag of dried food, a canteen of water, and a small medkit. "This should get you through," he said. "And take this." He pulled a comm device from his pocket, a small battered piece of tech that looked like it had seen better days. "It's got a secure channel. If you run into trouble, you can reach me, but don't use it unless you have to. Hunters have been tapping into comms lately." Marcus took the device, slipping it into his pocket. "Thanks, Jackson, I owe you one." Jackson snorted, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You owe me more than one, Reed, but we'll settle up later. For now, get some rest. You'll need it." Marcus and Lyra settled into the small room, the sound of the other refugees' quiet murmurs filtering through the walls. Lyra sat on the floor, Neera in her lap, her silver eyes distant as she hummed that same Clithar lullaby. Marcus watched her, a strange mix of emotions swirling in his chest, fear, determination, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. "We'll get you out of here," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I promise." Lyra looked up at him, her expression softening. "I believe you," she said, and for the first time Marcus felt the weight of her trust, a fragile but precious thing. The journey to the launch site was a grueling one. Marcus and Lyra left the safe house under the cover of darkness, moving through the outskirts of Nexus Prime, where the city gave way to barren wastelands and abandoned industrial zones. The air was thick with the smell of rust and decay, the ground littered with the remnants of a world that had been left to rot. They traveled mostly at night, hiding during the day in whatever shelter they could find. Abandoned factories, crumbling warehouses, even a rusted-out transport pod half buried in the dirt. The days were long and exhausting, the constant threat of discovery keeping them on edge. Marcus led the way, his knowledge of the city's outskirts proving invaluable as he navigated through hidden paths and forgotten trails. Lyra followed close behind, her military training evident in the way she moved, silent, precise, always alert. Neera miraculously remained quiet for most of the journey, as if sensing the danger they were in, her silver eyes wide and watchful. On the second day, they encountered another group of refugees, a small family of Clithar, led by an elderly man named Kale. He was tall and frail, his pearlescent skin faded with age, but his silver eyes still held a spark of defiance. With him were his daughter Mara and her 2 young children, both of whom clung to her legs, their faces etched with fear. Cale explained that they too were trying to reach the launch site, having heard of Rhea's ship through the underground. "Network, there is strength in numbers," Kyle said, his voice soft but firm. "We should travel together." Marcus hesitated, glancing at Lyra. More people meant more risk, more noise, more chances of being spotted. But Cale was right. Alone, they were vulnerable. But together, they might stand a better chance. Lyra nodded, her expression resolute. "We will help each other," she said. The group continued together, their pace slow but steady. Kyle and Mara proved to be valuable allies. Cale's knowledge of Cleather's survival techniques helped them find food and water in the barren landscape, while Mara's quiet strength kept her children calm, even in the face of danger. Lyra and Mara bonded quickly, their shared experiences as Clethar mothers creating an unspoken understanding between them. Marcus watched them, a small smile tugging at his lips as he saw Lyra laugh for the first time. A soft, unguarded sound that warmed his heart. But the journey was not without its challenges. On the third night, as they sheltered in an abandoned factory, they were ambushed by a group of scavengers, desperate men and women who roamed the wastelands, preying on anyone they could find. The attack came without warning. The scavengers, bursting through the rusted doors with makeshift weapons, their eyes glinting with greed and hunger. Marcus reacted quickly, drawing his hunting knife and positioning himself between the scavengers and the group. Lyra and Cale fought alongside him, their movements a blur of precision and strength, while Mara shielded the children, her voice steady as she whispered reassurances. The fight was brutal but brief. Marcus took down 2 of the scavengers, while Lyra and Cale handled the rest, their military training giving them an edge. When it was over, the factory floor was littered with the bodies of their attackers, the air thick with the smell of blood and rust. "We cannot stay here," Cale said, his voice grim as he wiped the blood from his hands. "There may be more." Marcus nodded, his chest heaving as he caught his breath. "We're close to the launch site," he said. "We need to keep moving." They left the factory behind, the weight of the encounter hanging heavy over them. The children were shaken, their small bodies trembling as they clung to Mara, and even Lyra seemed more guarded than before, her silver eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. Marcus walked beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife, a silent promise to protect them. They reached the launch site just as dawn broke on the 4th day, the sky a soft violet streaked with gold. The site was hidden deep in the wastelands, a small clearing surrounded by rusted machinery and crumbling structures, the perfect place to conceal a ship from prying eyes. Rhea's cargo ship sat in the center of the clearing, a battered but sturdy vessel with a hull scarred by years of travel. Rhea herself stood beside it, a wiry woman in her 40s with short-cropped hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She carried a blaster on her hip, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon as she waited for her passengers. Jackson had radioed ahead, and Rhea was expecting them. She greeted Marcus with a curt nod, her gaze flickering to Lyra, Cale, and the others. "You're cutting it close," she said, her voice clipped. "We've got hunters sniffing around the area. We need to move fast." Marcus nodded, helping Lyra and the others board the ship. The interior was cramped but functional, with rows of seats along the walls and crates of supplies stacked in the corners. Rhea led them to a small compartment in the back where they could sit together during the journey. "Strap in," she said. "It's going to be a bumpy ride." As the ship's engines roared to life, Marcus felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. They had escaped Nexus Prime, but the journey was far from over. The outer colonies were a lawless place, a frontier where survival was never guaranteed. But for Lyra, Nira, and the others, it was a chance at a new life, a chance to start over. Lyra sat beside him, Nira in her lap, her silver eyes fixed on the small window as the ship lifted off. The city skyline stretched out below them, its lights flickering against the dawn, a prison they were finally leaving behind. Marcus reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and she squeezed back without hesitation. They were in this together, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them had to look over their shoulder. 6 months later, Marcus stood on the edge of a small wooden deck, staring out at the rolling green hills of Vara III. The planet was a stark contrast to the frozen city they'd left behind, its air warm and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers, its sky a soft violet streaked with gold. Twin suns rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the small settlement that stretched along the river's edge. The settlement was a mix of humans and Clithar, refugees, traders, and settlers looking for a fresh start. Here, no one cared where you came from, only where you were going. Behind him, the sound of quiet laughter reached his ears. He turned, leaning against the railing, and saw Lyra and Nira sitting on a blanket spread across the grass. Nira had grown stronger since they'd arrived, her pearlescent skin glowing with health, her silver eyes bright with curiosity. She was no longer the frail infant Marcus had held that night in the storm. Now she was full of life, crawling and babbling, reaching for everything with her small hands. Lyra sat cross-legged beside her, her silver eyes soft with warmth as she let Nira tug at a strand of her long, dark hair. The baby squealed happily, shaking her tiny fists, and Lyra laughed, a real, unguarded laugh that Marcus had come to cherish. Kyle, Mara, and the children had settled nearby, their small family, thriving in the safety of the settlement. Kyle had taken on the role of a teacher, passing down Clithar knowledge to the younger generation, while Mara had started a small garden, her children helping her tend to the crops. The community was small but tight-knit, a place where people looked out for each other, a place where Lyra and Nira could finally be free. Marcus smiled to himself, pushing off the railing and making his way over to them. The moment Nira saw him, her silver eyes lit up, and she let out an excited chirp, a Clithar sound that Marcus had learned meant happiness. She reached for him instantly, her small fingers grasping at the air. Marcus chuckled, scooping her up, effortlessly. "You're getting heavy, kid," he said, adjusting her in his arms. Nira babbled in response, pressing her face against his chest, her tiny hands grabbing at his shirt. Lyra watched them, her smile lingering. "She likes you," she said, her voice warm. Marcus smirked, glancing down at Nira. "Yeah, well, I am pretty likable." Lyra rolled her eyes, but there was amusement in her gaze. Marcus adjusted Nira in his arms, watching as the baby reached up, touching his face with curious fingers. "You think she'll remember any of it?" he asked, his voice softer now. The cold, the fear. Lyra's smile dimmed slightly, her gaze distant. "No," she said, shaking her head. "She was too young." Marcus exhaled, relieved. "Good." Lyra shifted closer, resting a hand on Nira's back as the baby curled against him. "She will only remember this," she said, her voice filled with a quiet certainty. Marcus looked at her, at the way the sunlight caught in her dark hair, at the way her silver eyes shone with something softer than before. She wasn't just talking about Nira. This was her life now, too, not running, not hiding, just living. Marcus reached for Lyra's hand, threading his fingers through hers, and she squeezed back without hesitation. They had found a home, and, for the first time in a long time, the future felt like theirs to shape. The wind carried the scent of wildflowers through the air as the twin suns continued to rise, painting the sky with light, a new dawn, a new beginning.